My next task with this shutter was to disassemble the shutter and take pictures of all the steps, making sure I had note of where any springs were connected, where levers sat relative to each other, and generally hoping to be able to put the thing back together in a useful fashion. But before we get to that, we'll just have a look at this part. This part, of course, is the mount that the shutter mounts to, and this is fairly simple in its construction. It's got a spring-loaded piece here. When it's cocked, that's spring-loaded. A release is here that allows that to roll back. At this section here, that gear there couples to the shutter itself and cocks the shutter. This piece here couples to the arm on the bottom of the mirror box here. This arm is connected to nothing inside the mirror box. It's just simply a mounting point for it. This arm is driven by the film advance. Our mirror box is quite interesting. The action here is there's a capping plate mounted on the bottom and drops away to the bottom. The mirror is hinged traditionally at the top edge. As this sector revolves, this gear here, first the mirror rises out of the way, then the capping plate drops out of the way. At this stage the shutter would be cocked, you'd be ready to take your photo. The shutter release is this arm on the side here, and that little cam you see there would swing this release lever over. This release lever's normally got a nice return spring on here, but it's somewhere else in the room at the moment and doesn't want to make its presence known. So this is all on the ugly camera that I took apart, and it was useful in some ways, I'd say. It allowed me to discover how things would be assembled. However, as I say, I took this apart and I take note of everything that was in there, stripped the shutter right down to the basics, and that was the plan, to strip it down completely and to put it back together again. And the idea was that once it was all back together again, it would be in a good state. I could either choose to use it in the good camera or choose to reassemble this camera and transfer the parts from the good camera. And I did manage to get this shutter to function. You see that it does in fact work, but there were a few tricks along the way. I very carefully took the shutter apart, took a great series of photos so that I could see exactly where everything fitted, taking great care to note and take photos of where springs were hooked, where levers connected behind other levers, and to make sure I had a good understanding of how the shutter had been assembled. Everything went stunningly until I went to remove the cocking shaft. Now the cocking shaft, quite commonly with a camera like this, just goes through the case, would have a squared off end or something similar, a D shape on this end for example, and be driven from the outside of the case with a gear coupled to that. In this case it was slightly different. The shaft passed through the shutter, passed through this cocking gear here, and this cocking gear was freer to rotate on the shaft, with the exception that there was a pin on our shaft, and as the gear rotated it would hit the pin and rotate the shaft with it. Normally the pin would be fixed in a couple of ways. It could easily be threaded into the rod, or it could be a tapered pin just driven into the rod. It could even be riveted, in which case typically it would pass through the rod and be riveted on the far side. Either of those methods would have worked. What I just looked at this, I tried unscrewing it, it didn't unscrew. It obviously wasn't riveted on the outside, so I decided it was a tapered pin, and I tried to drive the pin out, and the pin wouldn't come out. So I tried pulling the pin out with a pair of pliers, and typically that should have just resulted in the pin becoming more and more bent as I drew it out, but it would have left the shaft untouched, and I would have just found another pin and replaced it with that. In this case, what happened was that the shaft broke. It turns out that the little pin that ran through there had been riveted, but it had been riveted internally in the shaft, so it only went part the way through the shaft and its end had been spread, so it wouldn't come back out of the hole. So the shaft was ruined, and basically it meant that this shutter could not be used on the camera I was going to assemble. It was basically buggered. But more importantly, it meant that I also couldn't disassemble the other shutter, and of course I didn't know what state the other shutter was in at this stage, because this looked like the better prospect in terms of a working camera. So yes, that left me pondering for a wee while. So after disassembling everything, taking all my photos, I did eventually clean everything in here. I had it stripped right down, all the blades out, cleaned away all the sticky grease, and it was very, very sticky, and I reassembled it. I was able to make this into a working shutter, except of course for the fact that you cannot cock it from the outside. But it did at least teach me how the shutter was assembled. And so when I went back some months later, after thinking a lot about it and pushing the job to the back of the bench, I did know how the shutter was constructed, and I was able to take the other shutter and deal with it in a different fashion. And basically I didn't remove that shaft, because the shaft cannot be practically removed, and it meant that in terms, of course, I couldn't remove the main drive spring underneath there. I was able to strip the other parts out of the shutter and clean them. The blades, and I was only able to deal with by flood cleaning, and flood cleaning is very much a second best option, but in this case it was our only option. So that was a lesson to me, and it means that these shutters would never have been serviceable in the way that shutters are normally serviced. When shutters are normally serviced, any leaf blade shutters, they are stripped completely, right down to the case. The case is cleaned, all the blades go back and nice and clean. This could never have had that done. The method of the construction meant that that was just not an option. So in the fullness of time, I dismantled the second camera, the prettier one that I wanted to work on. I completely stripped our shutter mount here, which is the focus helical, and the mount for the shutter, and the cocking mechanism for the shutter. So I completely stripped that down, cleaned away all its old grease, made sure everything was functioning and running smoothly, lubricated that, reassembled it, taking great note of where everything sat. The mirror box, I was able to clean up the mirror box that I had. I chose the better of the two mirror boxes, and I replaced the foam underneath the mirror at the top, and there's a piece that sits in the bottom underneath the capping plate when that drops down. I replaced both those pieces of foam, cleaned away all the rubbish. I had to clean the body everywhere that foam had been. You can see this one, this is the other one, you can see that foam is just crumbly rubbish. All of that stuff had to be very carefully cleaned away, blown out, everything wiped down with acetone and solvents to remove any traces of that before I put it back together. And the shutter itself, well, the shutter itself for this shutter, I mean, my options were fairly limited, I suppose you could say. I I knew I couldn't completely disassemble it because of the limitation caused by the way that it had been constructed. So what I did was I stripped out all the componentry from the top, all our speed trains, all the levers, got the camera pretty much stripped down to its base plate, but did not disassemble beyond that point. I removed all the componentry from the rear in a likewise fashion, but I didn't split the case and I didn't remove the blades for cleaning. The blades I chose to clean in place. Now that method is typically referred to as flood cleaning. It is exceptionally second best as a method of working on cameras, but in this case it was the only practical option, short of some fairly heroic machining work, if I decided I wanted to go about it in a different way. But it did work out for the best in the end. But I can tell you that I had this job sitting around, I think 5 months, from the time everything went bad until the day I decided I would go back and put it back together again. But in the end, the result was good. Here we have it. This is our Topcon Wink Mirror E, and it's all working. So how did I deal with this one? Well, I stripped the camera down completely. Its problems were, its main problem was to do with dried out grease. Grease was all through the shutter. The shutter was effectively jammed up, as the other one was, with grease. The blades just didn't move. But its other problem was that the foam light seals inside the shutter, inside the camera, which would have run around the back of the mirror box here in the housing, and various other ones around the place in the mirror box itself, up in here and down in the bottom, they were crumbled. And of course, when the foam light seals are crumbled, the bits and pieces fall everywhere. So the entire camera was full of these little bits of grey foam rubbish, and had to be very carefully cleaned in order to get that rubbish out. And what I did with the shutter this time round, well, I stripped it down a little bit further than this. I removed all these components you can see on the top, slow speed train, self-timer, things of that nature. All the control rings from the back, stripped all those off, cleaned all those, and the diaphragm blades and the shutter blades I cleaned in place. I basically flood cleaned it using lots and lots of CRC Lectra Clean Heavy Duty, which tells me it removes oils, grease, wax, dirt, moisture, and probably gives anything within a 100-mile radius cancer. Lots and lots of that flooded in it, worked through the mechanism, cleaned away with about 1.5 packets of cotton buds, and I was able to get the shutter to work reliably. For good measure, I lubricated the shutter blades and the diaphragm blades with a bit of graphite powder, made sure I blew all the excess of that out, and I was left with a shutter that functioned and a camera that worked again. So this has the exposure meter from the casualty. It has the shutter assembly from the second camera, since the first shutter was suffering from a distorted body. Even apart from that piece I'd managed to break on it. The other components, like this piece here, that all had to be disassembled and cleaned. It was full of dirty old grease, and the focus helical was jammed up with old grease too. That was all very, very sticky, so all that had to be completely disassembled to allow these rings to move. You can see this one here, the rings are loose because I've had them off. I learned a lot more about how that was constructed, and basically all cleaned, lubricated and put back together. So if somebody offers you the opportunity to work on their Topcon Wink Mirror E camera, just back politely away. Don't go anywhere near it. It was, I wouldn't say it was a minor nightmare, I suppose. My biggest problems were facing with this shaft and working out how I was going to get around that problem. Clearly the camera was never intended to receive any major service. It was obviously intended to be assembled, sold and gone. At this stage, in fact not unlike the present, camera models would change extremely frequently. They were probably not the same model made from one end of the year to the next. The manufacturer would always be onto something new and shiny, something new and improved, and hopefully better able to grab the attention of the market. So this camera can go back to its owner now, and I'm sure they're very impatient. They've been waiting for this for a long time, but it was not one of the easiest cameras I've ever had to work on, and I'm certainly not in a hurry to ever see another one again. So thanks for watching.